Anyone following world affairs and the war in Ukraine in particular likely felt the shock waves that cut across Europe and resonated in the North Atlantic region throughout the month of February 2025. You are listening to This Month in EU Sanctions, a podcast at the crossroads of EU law, business, and foreign policy. I am Jan Dunin-Wasowicz, your main host. In This Month in EU Sanctions, we'll discuss all things sanctions, export controls, and trade compliance from an EU perspective. In addition to a monthly selection of legal, regulatory, and policy updates, each episode will discuss a topic of particular interest or feature a conversation with a guest. At a time of great uncertainty, the podcast seeks to offer clear information and insights, bringing together people who make, practice, or study modern European security law. While it is too early to fully appreciate the consequences of the course chartered by the new US administration, the 16th package of EU sanctions against Russia, adopted on February 24, 2025 to mark the third year of the full-scale invasion, was yet another watershed moment for EU sanctions policy. Was the 16th package the last EU sanctions package against Russia, or the first one of a new series, adopted perhaps differently, autonomously, in a new format of the new sanctions coalition? As the Council noted, the 16th package was designed to further ramp up pressure on the aggressor as part of the EU's unwavering commitment to a just and lasting peace for Ukraine. Speaking in Kyiv on that day, European Commission President von der Leyen noted that the EU will increase punitive sanctions against Russia unless they demonstrate true willingness to achieve a lasting peace agreement. On its face, the 16th package signaled that EU sanctions are here to stay, possibly in the very long run, even if the US disengages from or significantly reduces its role in the sanctions coalition. In fact, EU sanctions policymakers may find very good arguments to keep EU sanctions in place, or even continue to expand them. For the private sector, this creates a new landscape. Companies, EU and non-EU operators alike, could possibly have to prepare for an environment where EU sanctions would become a key, if not the main, sanctions regime against Russia. This landscape would create new compliance risks. To appreciate the nature of these risks, it is helpful to understand and keep in mind at least two key principles. The first one, which is often underappreciated, is the fact that EU sanctions jurisdiction is actually quite broad. EU sanctions apply A, within the territory of the EU, B, on board any aircraft or vessel under the jurisdiction of a member state, C, to any person inside or outside the territory of the EU who is a national of a member state, D, to any legal person, entity, or body inside or outside the territory of the EU which is incorporated or constituted under the law of a member state, and finally E, to any legal person, entity, or body in respect of any business done in whole or in part within the EU. The second principle is that since 2022, the EU has sought different ways to expand the influence, reach, and impact of its sanctions. For instance, in the 14th package, the EU introduced new obligations requiring EU operators to undertake their best efforts to ensure that any entity established outside the EU that they own or control does not participate in activities that undermine EU sanctions adopted against Russia and Belarus. In the 16th package, the EU continued to expand its sanctions toolbox. For instance, the EU introduced two new listing criteria allowing the imposition of sanctions against persons anywhere in the world, in the first case, forming part of, supporting materially or financially or benefiting from Russia's military and industrial complex. And in the second case, persons owning, controlling, managing, operating, or providing services to Russia's shadow fleet. The EU added, for the first time, the foreign branch of a Russian bank to the list of financial institutions subject to a complete transaction ban because of its use of the SPFS. The EU expanded the best efforts requirements to asset freeze measures and broadened the scope of other compliance measures. The 16th package also included measures targeting Belarus and other actions concerning Crimea and Sevastopol, as well as the non-government controlled areas of Ukraine. In short, the EU continued to innovate with the 16th package, adding numerous trade and compliance controls. A full summary of this package is referenced in the last edition of the newsletter. I am thrilled to welcome our first guest, Saskia Rietbroek. Saskia is the Executive Director and co-founder of the Association of Certified Sanctions Specialists, ACSS, a professional membership organization for sanctions professionals worldwide. I asked Saskia to join the podcast to reflect on the evolution of the EU trade compliance community 3 years into Russia's war of aggression. I greatly enjoyed speaking with Saskia about her practical perspective, looking back at the evolution of the practice since 2014, and discussing the challenges ahead. Saskia, hello, welcome to the program.
Hi, thank you. Well, thank you, Jan.
Well, I am very lucky to have you on the show. As you know, this is the first episode and the first guest interview. So I am not completely sure you know what you've signed up for, but thanks very much for taking the risk.
Yeah, no, sure. No problem. Looking forward to it.
Saskia, before we discuss a little bit your background and how you came to founding and leading the Association of Certified Sanctions Specialists, I wanted to take a moment and maybe to reflect a little bit on where we were in the sanctions community, and more specifically on where you were around 3 years ago on this day, on February 21st, when Russia made this announcement concerning 2 regions of Ukraine.
I was physically in the Netherlands, I remember that. And I suddenly realized that, with everything going on, I think I was actually planning on attending some sort of social event on that day. And I remember I canceled it because I realized that there was going to be so much change, so much to read, so many new regulations to follow that I didn't go. This event was actually, I was preparing for sailing, new sailing diploma, and I canceled it. And sailing is my hobby, so it was a sacrifice that I immediately realized I had to take. To keep
immediately
up to speed.
Sensed that there's something big coming. Huh? Yeah, that was my feeling as well. I remember watching the speech and thinking there's going to be something of historical proportions here coming very, very soon. Saskia, you're a leading figure in the sanctions and export controls community, and in particular in Europe. I think it'd be very interesting for our listeners to get to know you a little bit more and understand your professional background and how you got to the EU, or into the EU sanctions space more specifically.
Yeah, well, I think very few people plan to get into the EU sanction space, right, when they are in university. I have a background in international law. I have a law degree from Leiden University in the Netherlands, and EU sanctions weren't on my mind at all at the time. After I graduated, I wanted to travel to South America. And that's what I did. I lived in Peru for almost 10 years. I was admitted to the Lima Bar Association and worked as an attorney at a law firm in Lima. At that point, I was in South America. There are many, SDN, kingpins and everything. I never met any of them. So I still didn't think at all about EU sanctions or any other sanctions. But then I moved to Miami, and I got in touch with somebody who led a group that was more focused on anti-money laundering. And I became the executive director of another industry association, and they were focused on anti-money laundering. And at that point, I I got in touch with sanctions in general. We organized seminars and conferences on AML, and there was maybe on the 2 days there were 10 minutes that we covered sanctions. And a few years later, when I was back in the Netherlands, that's where I started reading and learning more about sanctions, and in particularly the EU sanctions.
Wow, so you had to go all the way to South America to get into that space.
Yeah. It ultimately led me to where I am now, yes.
We know today in the EU-Russia sanctions that it's not uncommon to deal with EU sanctions topics in very distant locations and jurisdictions, including in South America. Do you remember, just out of curiosity, when the first time you studied or you looked at an EU sanctions topic, what was the context or the legal regime or the policy concern that was pressing at the time?
Yeah, I remember when I returned to the Netherlands, at that time, this was like around 2012 or so, 2013, 14, around that time. The most pressing issue in EU sanctions at the time was, on the one hand, the sanctions against Iran. This was just before the JCPOA in 2015. And on the other hand, we had the first wave of sanctions against Russia, right? Because of the 2014 illegal annexation of Crimea. And this last one was a really important topic for the Netherlands, because the Russians had shut down a flight, MH17, over the Ukraine, where almost 200 Dutch nationals died. So this was something that was very much in the press. The sanctions on Russia at that time weren't that broad, but they did prohibit the sale of goods and provision of technical assistance to Crimea. And the Dutch newspapers at that time were covering stories about Dutch companies that were involved in the building of the bridge between Russia and Crimea. So yeah, I think that was one of the pressing issues here in the Netherlands, at least, with regards to EU sanctions.
Yeah, and how did the EU sanctions compliance community look like at the time? It's obviously the Russian second aggression of 2022, has prompted massive changes on the market and in compliance organizations. But it's always helpful to reflect back a little bit and think about how the community has evolved over the years. And so how did it look like back then?
Yeah, at that time, I heard from my clients, my customers, that sanctions had become, more and more important. So we're talking like 2016, 2017. When we started ACSS, this was in 2018, there was no group like us. So there was no real community among the sanctions compliance professionals. There were probably hundreds of thousands of associations, right, in the world, but none of them were devoted to the particular needs and wants of this group. I'm talking about the needs of people both in private and public walks of life who are working either full-time or maybe they're in sanctions, or perhaps their job touches on it. And many of them felt that sanctions was an underappreciated aspect of corporate due diligence and enterprise security management. So we changed that by offering them their own group, their own community, and dedicated training resources on this particular topic.
Would you say that was the main reason that led you to start ACSS in 2018, or were there other factors or that drove the project?
Yeah, no, I think that the fact that I had experience in running a community of AML professionals and building a certification, a exam-based certification on that particular topic.
Yeah.
And then, when my contacts and the community asked me, said, Saskia, you should really think of doing something like that for our group, for sanctions. So I think that was the main driver to do this. And there was a real, there was really nothing for them. When they went to a financial crime conference or an anti-money laundering conference, there was maybe one session of the 2 or 3 days of conference. And that's it. And at that time, there was a lot going on already. So there was a need for more in-depth training and support on this topic.
And it was your audience and membership primarily focused on financial institutions and that part of the community, or were you also seeing requests from more of the industry or other sectors?
Yeah, no, we gained a lot of traction, especially after 2022 in any industry. So we're talking energy, manufacturing, logistics, transportation, import, export, pharmaceutical. We so we have a really diverse audience because sanctions touch all these industries, and we're closing in about 2,000 members right now in 70 plus countries. We have 8 chapters, 5 of which are in Europe. So I think that underscores the importance of benchmarking between sanctions and export controls professionals here in Europe.
Mm-hmm. What would you say is the when you look at the demand side in your community, what was the most, I think at the time still, the most common question or topic that your members were raising or asking about, if that's even possible to sort of describe? But
yeah, I think at that time when we started, there was a lot of demand for anything related to OFAC,
mm-hmm.
even in Europe, because that's the enforcement was from the US side. So there were several large institutions, banks here in Europe that had been in settlements with OFAC and the Department of Justice for sanctions violations. So when we started, there was I think a lot of the questions for training were related to OFAC. Now we see a lot more diversity in the demand for training. Like lately, we get a lot of requests and questions from financial institutions in particular on frameworks and training that they need to put in place to cover so-called activity-based sanctions. So beyond the traditional financial sanctions. So they ask us, what training can you provide to manage, for example, trade finance related Russian sanctions risks, or export controls diversion risks for not only their sanctions team, but even broader for their CDD teams or their know your customer teams. So I see that, I think the requirements for training have really evolved and are a lot more sophisticated to just cover OFAC and financial sanctions.
And relatedly, have you seen an increase in demand for EU-specific training or support?
Yeah, absolutely. It was interesting, after the war started, we thought we already had a course on EU sanctions in our library of courses, and we thought that immediately everybody would want to buy that course. But everybody was so busy in our community to basically operationalize the new prohibitions that there was no time for training. We saw the demand for our EU sanctions course really increase like 6 months down the road. Mm-hmm. So more towards the latter part of 2022. And that demand is still there. The EU sanctions course has become one of our most popular courses, in fact.
And in your view, what makes a good EU sanctions training? What are if someone were to come to you and say, Saskia, I want to write up a training plan for EU sanctions compliance, what would be your recipe for making a good, effective? And conversely, what do you think doesn't work or is not effective when you try to train teams, people, the business on these topics?
Yeah, it depends a little bit on the target audience, right? So if you train the compliance people, they have different needs than the, let's say, the operational teams or the business teams, right? When you train the operational teams, the business lines, the relationship managers, the frontline staff, they need very practical stuff, right? They need to know, okay, what is a red flag and who do I need to call, when I see it? So when we train the sanctions compliance or the export controls compliance professionals, of course, we go more into depth in terms of, what are the prohibitions exactly, what is still allowed, what is not allowed, because those are the questions that they need to answer from their business lines. So we go more into that particular area. So it depends a little bit on the target audience. We've also trained like senior management, and then you need to somehow convince them that this is something that can cost the company a lot of money when things go wrong. So that's yet another angle that you want to cover. How do you get them to attend this training, get them off their yachts and come to this compliance training?
And you obviously engage a lot with your members. And I was curious to ask you, do you see any particular challenge or something that gives you reason to worry or be concerned about how these sanctions work or are being applied? Is there something that keeps you up at night a little bit when you're sort of so immersed in the community and you tell yourself, well, there's still this and that we should really need to be working on?
Yeah, I think the topic of circumvention, I mean, there are many challenges, right? And depending on the member, you get different answers there, what their big challenge is. But one of the things that, that really worries me, I had a very, I think, memorable talk last year with one of our, he wasn't a member, but he was, he called me basically out of the blue, a junior sanctions compliance officer from the Netherlands here. And I remember the call, it was a typical Dutch summer, rainy afternoon. He called me and he said, yeah, sorry to bother you, but I'm, working for a logistics company in the port of Rotterdam. And I didn't know him personally, but he asked me if I had a few minutes to spare. And he said, I thought it would be a typical call of somebody who wants to know more about ACSS. But I noticed he wasn't very comfortable, and he really started to become emotional, and his voice broke when he started sharing his story. And he told me that he worked for this Dutch company that made him the compliance officer a few months ago, and he didn't have a lot of background in compliance nor training, but they told him, well, somebody has to do it. You're the one. You're going to be our new sanctions officer, and the firm, you have to stay out of trouble. And, I said, well, that's great. It's maybe a challenging job, but, it's a great field to be in, a great career perspective. But then, the conversation really took a different turn, because he said after he started his job and started looking, doing his job, he noticed something strange. And his gut feeling said, there's something wrong here with our clients and our transactions, because, and we appear to be evading sanctions here in our company. There were fake end users, he said, there were companies in Turkey and the UAE, moving products forward. They were actually just middlemen, and they were exporting restricted products. And he had raised it with his superiors multiple times, but nobody wanted to hear it. They ignored him. And he was just this junior guy. He was being excluded from meetings, but he was still the compliance officer. So, he said, I want to blow the whistle, but I have a mortgage, I have a wife, I have a baby, and I don't know what to do. And I said, listen, if you decide to blow the whistle, that's up to you. But first of all, I would say, document everything and leave the company, because you don't want to be caught in the middle, and you have to document, make sure that you raise this issue and escalate it as much as possible, put everything in writing, but leave that position. And, looking back on this conversation, I realized it was it was something that I will remember for a long time. And it was a sobering idea, because I had traveled to countries around the world like Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan doing capacity building about sanctions circumvention. And then yet, here in my own country, there's companies that are involved in these schemes willingly. So that is something that kept me up at night.
This is a great real-life example, I think, that should remind us all that effective implementation and compliance begins at home. And compliance is a people's business. And it is sometimes overlooked that the cultural element in a company is absolutely fundamental. People shouldn't be worried or afraid or discouraged to raise concerns and escalate these issues in fear of retribution or sanction. So I think it's very important in these training to emphasize that for the processes to work, assuming you have good process, you need the right culture and you need the right tone and you need the right support from top management. Saskia, you mentioned that you were doing things in Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, among other jurisdictions, it seems. That intrigues me quite a bit. What were you up to in the capacity building? Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Since the war in Ukraine started 3 years ago, it turns out that the Kremlin is still finding ways to get their hands on chips and drones and other sanctioned goods, and uses these in their war in the Ukraine. And there's a thriving trade, involving all these networks of smugglers and front companies, professional enablers. All these networks have their tentacles in transit countries like in the Middle East, in Asia, Central Asia, South America. And tackling circumvention has become a very important point for regulators, including the European Commission. So I was approached by the Commission, I think it was early 2023, for a new project that they were launching to do capacity building related to circumvention of Russian sanctions, EU sanctions, right? And they asked me to work as the head of training for these projects, and go with them, put the team together and go with them to these countries in Central Asia and the Middle East to give them a training, basically capacity building on both for the governments there and also for the private sector, on EU sanctions and circumvention. So it was a very, it's been an amazing project. And I do believe that these types of outreach have an impact. It was really, a good experience.
I think, more personally, one of the most fascinating, evolution of EU sanctions law and compliance over the past several years is its growing international or global reach. And you see this in so many different forms, whether it is through these indirect prohibitions, everything related to evasion circumvention, of course, the no re-export to Russia or Belarus clauses, the best efforts obligations. That's really pushing the discussion on EU sanctions compliance beyond the EU. And I think this is quite new for a lot of people in this space. And what were your impressions when discussing EU sanctions topics in these jurisdictions?
Yeah, I had some interesting conversations during these seminars with the folks, the businesses on the ground. Some of these businesses were, subsidiaries of EU headquartered companies, and they at times felt that, we are incorporated in, let's say Malaysia or Kazakhstan. So, the sanctions don't really apply. But that, right now with the best efforts obligation from the 14th package, I think it was, there's now new requirements to make sure that these non-EU subsidiaries do not undermine the EU sanctions. So I think the onus of compliance has now also incorporates these subsidiaries in other countries. But, these people who work in these companies, they don't have a full-time job as a compliance officer. Sometimes it's the business owner who attends the seminar. He has 10,000 things going on, right? He needs to make sure that he gets business. He needs to make sure that he, the light stays on in his office. So there's many things on his mind, and this is so complicated. So I do see that sometimes it's mind-boggling for them and they just want to stay out of trouble. They say, listen, I don't want to get any issue. What should I do to stay compliant? So you have companies like that. On the other hand, you also see companies that want to walk the fine line. Say, can I get away with this? Can I do that? Would you notice if we do this? I got questions like that.
You were actually asked that? Oh, yeah.
Yeah. They, would we, if we do this, would you guys notice in Europe? So yeah, those are questions that you get in the break, not so much during the seminar.
Well, Saskia, where do you think all of this is headed? All these efforts. Maybe I'll narrow it to EU sanctions compliance here as we enter into early 2025.
Yeah, I get that question, and if we look at it from a big picture, right? If you look at like the modern history of sanctions, you see that their use has increased the last couple of decades. So why is that? Not because of a particular leader, not because of one particular country is at the helm of the council, not because of a particular, US president, and not because suddenly governments are much more concerned about human rights or protecting democratic, values. I think it has to do, quite frankly, with a more structural economic reason and economic security. I think that's why we have seen sanctions being used so frequently in the last decades on both sides of the Atlantic. The world economy used to be based on sort of a benign relationship between countries, a benign geopolitical environment. But that has changed. We have such a intense geopolitical environment, and we have geopolitical competition. So you see sanctions being used not only by the EU and the US, but you see sanctions, coming out of China, coming out of Japan, coming out of Russia, and everybody is trying to get some sort of economic security to protect their interest also from an economic perspective. So I think first of all, big picture, we will continue to see a growth in the use of sanctions by all these different countries.
And what about Europe more specifically, or the EU?
So I think European companies are under fast rising pressure to improve their processes. And like I said, this is not going away. So we could expect, under, the new US presidency, we may not only see divergence, which is always a headache, right, for EU companies, but we could see even sanctions on Europe, so that will be a compliance nightmare. And, what with the current, Polish presidency, I think there will be more, I'm sure, to underscore the fact that we as Europeans continue to support the Ukraine, and the sanctions against Russia will definitely not be going away.
It's obviously premature and we don't want to speculate, but at least in theory, on the assumption that some members of the sanctions coalition would ease or lift part of their sanctions, and if we assume that we in the EU have no interest or desire to ease or lift those sanctions, EU sanctions against Russia could become one of the dominant, if not the dominant, sanctions regime on that country. So that would be a completely different environment and a whole new level of responsibility, politically speaking, and in terms of compliance expectations for European business.
EU enforcement cases are starting finally to ramp up. There was, I remember that what I mentioned, what happened years ago with this, with the first wave of sanctions in 2014 against Russia. There's a case that came out that are now starting to come out because of those sanctions 10 years ago, right? We have a case in the Netherlands only last year where a Dutch company was fined almost 2 million euros for their involvement in the construction of this bridge in Crimea. So I think the enforcement actions will increase in Europe, and that is something that, of course, will get the attention from the C-suites in the companies, and that ultimately will put more pressure on the compliance officers to make sure that their companies stay out of trouble with EU sanctions.
Saskia, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me, and it was an absolute delight discussing with you. All the best for ACSS, and look forward to speaking again.
Thank you very much, Jan. It was my pleasure.
This concludes this month's episode. If you've enjoyed the show, I hope you'll consider subscribing or writing a review on any platform you are used to. This Month in EU Sanctions is also a newsletter on LinkedIn. Links are available in the show's notes. Thank you for listening, and tune in soon for the next episode.